For more than 5 decades, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a musician. He was a cultural earthquake, a walking contradiction of chaos and charm, tragedy and triumph. He was the kind of figure that parents once warned their kids about, while those same kids sneaked into record stores to buy his albums anyway. He wasn't just a prince of darkness. He was proof that you could come from nothing, stumble through every possible disaster, and still carve your name into music history so deeply that even time itself couldn't erase it. But behind the flashing lights, the stage theatrics, and the larger-than-life persona, there was always something darker, something more human. Ozzy Osbourne's story is not simply about the rise of a rock star. It's about the long shadow of childhood trauma, the crushing weight of addiction, the sting of betrayal, and the relentless way time robs even the strongest performers of their fire. It's about how one man carried pain like a second skin and somehow turned that pain into an empire. At the height of his power, Ozzy was untouchable. He sold over 100 million records, toured the world endlessly, and transformed himself from a broke factory worker into a household name. His fortune at the time of his passing in 2025? Over $220 million. His home spanned continents, from sprawling English estates to Beverly Hills mansions. His cars were as wild as his stage persona: Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, an Audi R8, and classic British beasts that reflected the duality of his personality, brutal and refined at the same time. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Money doesn't erase scars. Fame doesn't heal wounds. And no number of sold-out arenas could silence the voices that haunted Ozzy Osbourne from his earliest days in Birmingham to his final years battling Parkinson's. Behind every crazy story, every tabloid headline, and every unhinged TV moment was a man who had been fighting for survival long before anyone knew his name. And in the end, that survival became his true legacy. When Ozzy Osbourne finally took his last bow in 2025, the world didn't just lose a rock legend. It lost a man who embodied something far more powerful: the refusal to fade away quietly. His life was a testament to chaos, yes, but also to endurance, to the idea that sometimes the loudest statement you can make isn't about glory or perfection. It's about the simple act of refusing to disappear. So today, we're diving deep into the unbelievable life and tragic final days of Ozzy Osbourne. The fortune, the madness, the betrayals, the accidents, the disease that robbed him of his body but never his spirit, and the heartbreaking, almost poetic way he chose to leave the stage one final time. This isn't just another story about a celebrity's downfall. It's about how a broken boy turned his pain into the birth of heavy metal. It's about the people he lost, the battles he almost didn't survive, and the millions who saw themselves reflected in his raw, untamed scream. So the real question isn't just what happened to Ozzy Osbourne. The real question is, how did he keep going when every single thing in his life tried to stop him?
When Ozzy Osbourne finally left the stage for good, the headlines all repeated the same jaw-dropping number: $220 million. That's how much the so-called Prince of Darkness was worth at the time of his passing in 2025. For a man who once spent nights cold, hungry, and shoeless on the streets of Birmingham, the number itself feels almost unreal. But here's the thing. Ozzy's fortune wasn't the neat, polished kind you imagine when you think of millionaires in suits. No, his money was forged in chaos. 50 years of relentless touring, platinum records, endless television reruns, licensing deals, merchandise, and a steady river of royalties that poured in even when he was too sick to stand. It wasn't luck. It wasn't clean. It was survival, monetized. He sold over 100 million albums worldwide, both as Black Sabbath's howling frontman and as a solo act who refused to be erased. That alone is enough to make anyone rich. But Ozzy didn't just stick to the music. He built an empire that extended far beyond the stage. Take his real estate portfolio. Gothic in taste, global in scale. In the English countryside of Buckinghamshire, He owned a sprawling estate that didn't just have bedrooms and gardens, it had its own personal rehab wing. That detail alone tells you everything you need to know about how Ozzy lived. Excess and collapse woven into the walls themselves. In Los Angeles, he owned a luxury penthouse in Sierra Towers, a spot where A-list stars lived side by side, insulated from the chaos of the outside world. In Beverly Hills and Hancock Park, historic mansions bore witness to both the triumphs and tragedies of his family life. These weren't just houses, they were stages in their own right, each carrying scars from the chaos that followed Ozzy like a shadow. And then there were the cars, sleek, dark, thunderous machines that looked like they'd driven straight out of a nightmare and onto the freeway. An Audi R8, brutal yet elegant. A Ferrari 458, red and untamed. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, the ultimate symbol of decadent British luxury. And tucked among them, a collection of classic British cars that mirrored his own personality. Vintage, unpredictable, and somehow still roaring long after their prime. Television brought another tidal wave of wealth. In the early 2000s, the Osbournes aired on MTV and turned the world's most feared heavy metal frontman into, of all things, a confused, foul-mouthed dad wandering around his Beverly Hills mansion in slippers. The show was chaotic, often ridiculous, but it did something money can't usually buy. It humanized him. Suddenly, Ozzy wasn't just the wild man biting bats on stage. He was also the guy yelling at the dog to stop barking while his kids rolled their eyes at him. And with each broadcast, the checks piled up higher. But let's not get it twisted. Wealth never saved Ozzy. If anything, it just gave him a bigger arena to wrestle his demons in. Behind the Ferraris and chandeliers was a man who had never stopped being the broken boy from Birmingham. The trauma never disappeared. It simply moved into bigger houses. Even Ozzy himself knew this. He once admitted that the money and fame never gave him peace. They just bought him bigger cages. Whether it was the suffocating silence of a hotel room after a show or the echoing hallways of a mansion he barely felt at home in, the truth was the same. Ozzy's fortune was both a monument and a mask. Outside, people saw the gold records on the wall. Inside, he often saw only the ghosts that fame couldn't exorcise. And that's where the real story begins. Because if you only looked at the mansions, the cars, the millions, you'd think Ozzy's life was a rock and roll dream. But the reality? The reality was much darker. To understand the man behind the money, you have to go back, not to the mansion gates, not to the arena stages, but to the soot-choked streets of Birmingham, to the boy who would become the Prince of Darkness, but who started life with nothing but hunger, fear, and a silence that nearly swallowed him whole.
Long before the mansions, the platinum records, and the screaming crowds, there was just John Michael Osbourne, a boy born in 1948 into the gray, soot-stained streets of Aston, Birmingham. Back then, Birmingham was an industrial heartland, choking with factory smoke, rattling with steel, and heavy with poverty. And for a boy like Ozzy, poverty wasn't a temporary condition, it was the air he breathed. He grew up in a crumbling house with 5 siblings, where winters gnawed through thin walls and the wallpaper peeled like skin. His father, Jack, was a hard-working but emotionally distant man who spent long hours in the factories. Jack believed affection made children weak, so his love came in the form of strictness, silence, and the occasional heavy hand. His mother, Lillian, worked herself to the bone in car assembly lines, trying to keep food on the table, but exhaustion always won out. Whatever comfort she had to give, there was never enough of it to go around. From the start, Ozzy wasn't seen as the gifted one. He wasn't the clever one. He wasn't even the troublemaker. He was the forgotten one, the child who disappeared into corners, who blended into silence, who carried the weight of being overlooked so heavily that he began to believe he was invisible. At school, letters swam and numbers blurred. Teachers didn't know about dyslexia in the 1950s. They didn't recognize learning disorders. They just called it stupidity.
And once you were labeled stupid in a place like Aston, it wasn't just an insult, it was a sentence. Teachers stopped trying. Classmates didn't need an excuse to bully him. They broke him in alleys, behind buildings, with fists, with words, and with the even sharper cruelty of pretending he didn't exist. Nobody asked why he flinched when someone raised their hand. Nobody cared why his eyes seemed hollow. And when he came home beaten and broken, his father didn't offer comfort. He offered cold discipline. Pain in that house wasn't something you escaped. It was something you carried, without complaint, without tears. And Ozzy carried it, wrapped himself in silence, in shame, in the heavy knowledge that his existence made no sound the world was willing to hear. But silence doesn't heal, it hardens. And by 14, Ozzy's silence had turned into something unbearable. One night, in a small, dim room, he stood too still for too long, not moving, not breathing deeply, just waiting for the world to forget him once and for all. And maybe if life had gone differently, that would have been the end of the story. But life wasn't done with him yet. What pulled him back wasn't mercy. It was confusion, anger, and a kind of rage that he didn't understand at the time. He survived that moment, but not without scars. After that, something inside him cracked, or maybe it turned to stone. He stopped trying in school, stopped speaking unless forced, drifted through his teenage years like a ghost wearing skin. At 15, he walked out of the school gates for the last time. No qualifications, no skills, no voice. And the world didn't notice he was gone. He bounced from job to job, slaughterhouses, car horn factories, building sites. But the noise in his head was louder than the machines around him. He couldn't focus, couldn't function. Every job ended the same, dismissed, discarded, forgotten. And then came the hunger, the real kind. Thin clothes in freezing winters, holes in his shoes, a stomach that cried louder than his voice ever had. By 17, desperation screamed louder than anything else, and Ozzy answered with a mistake that would change his life, a botched burglary. It wasn't greed, it was hunger. He tried to steal clothes and got caught. The punishment? 6 weeks in Winson Green prison. Prison wasn't redemption, it wasn't hope. It was just another wall pressing in on him. Another reminder that he was, in his own words, worthless. But in the middle of that cold, gray tomb, something extraordinary happened. One afternoon, through the crackle of a battered prison radio, a sound stumbled through the static. The Beatles' She Loves You. And it didn't just break the silence, it shattered it. For the first time in his life, Ozzy felt a spark. Not ambition, not even hope, just need. A need to make sound, to scream, to matter. That moment didn't erase the fists, the insults, the hunger, or the shame, but it did something even rarer. It gave him a reason to keep breathing. I didn't know how to play, Ozzy later admitted, but I knew I had to be heard. In that prison cell, a vow was born. If he couldn't escape the darkness, he would become it. If no one would listen to his pain, he would make it roar loud enough to shake the heavens. That vow carried him out of prison. And though he was still broke, still broken, still seen as worthless by almost everyone around him, a seed had been planted. He wouldn't leave this world quietly. He would scream until somebody heard. And that scream, within just a few years, would evolve into the sound that redefined an entire genre.
By the late 1960s, Birmingham was bursting with noise. Clanging factories, smoke-choked streets, and a restless generation desperate for something more than gray skies and dead-end jobs. Out of that chaos came 4 young men who didn't fit anywhere else. Tony Iommi, who had lost the tips of his fingers in a factory accident but taught himself to play guitar anyway. Geezer Butler, whose head was full of mystical ideas and darker philosophies. Bill Ward, a drummer who hit like he was chasing away demons. And Ozzy Osbourne, the broken, unskilled kid who had nothing except a voice that sounded like pain itself. Together, they were a collection of misfits, and for a while they called themselves Earth. But one night, outside a cinema in Birmingham, Geezer saw a line of people waiting to be scared, waiting to watch a horror movie. That sparked an idea. Why not make music that terrifies people the way horror films do? If people pay to scream in theaters, maybe they'd pay to scream along with a band. With that thought, Earth was reborn as Black Sabbath, named after a 1963 horror film. It wasn't just a name change, it was a declaration. They weren't here to play nice. They were here to drag the shadows onto the stage. Their sound was unlike anything else at the time. Heavy, slow, dark. It didn't shimmer, it thundered. Tony's riffs sounded like steel bending under pressure. Geezer's bass lines crawled with menace. Bill's drums pounded like war. And Ozzy's voice cut through it all. High, haunting, otherworldly. It wasn't polished, it wasn't trained, but it was real. It was raw. It was the sound of a man who had survived hell and come back to tell the tale. On February 13th, 1970, yes, Friday the 13th, they released their debut album, Black Sabbath. Fate itself couldn't have scripted it better. Critics absolutely hated it. They called it crude, satanic, evil, trash, the kind of music that was going to rot young minds and lead society straight into the gutter. But the critics missed the point. This wasn't music for them. It wasn't music for the elite, or the polished, or the already comfortable. It was music for the kids who sat alone in their rooms feeling invisible, for the outcasts who thought no one would ever understand their pain, and when they put on that record, suddenly, someone did. Ozzy's wail wasn't entertainment. It was identification. It was solidarity. It was survival. The songs didn't hide their darkness. Black Sabbath, the title track, sounded like the gates of hell opening, and fans loved it because finally here was a band that wasn't pretending. They weren't singing about love and flowers. They were singing about the shadows that everyone else ignored. By the time their second album, Paranoid, dropped later that year, Black Sabbath had become unstoppable. Tracks like Iron Man, War Pigs, and Paranoid weren't just songs, they were cultural earthquakes. Ozzy's voice carried the weight of a man who had been broken and forgotten, and that authenticity made him magnetic. He didn't sound like a rock star, he sounded like a survivor. Audiences grew, tours expanded, and suddenly these four misfits from Birmingham were on stages in front of thousands, redefining what rock music could be. And in that moment, Ozzy found the first true purpose he'd ever known. For the first time in his life, the silence that had nearly destroyed him as a child was gone. Now his voice filled arenas. But with the fame came pressure. And with pressure came temptation. And with temptation came old demons that had never truly gone away. The world saw the rise of a heavy metal pioneer, but behind the scenes, Ozzy was still the boy from Aston, carrying bruises no stage light could erase. Black Sabbath had given him a stage, a family, and a reason to live, but nothing stays perfect forever. Fame would soon reveal itself to be just another cage, and this time, it was a gilded one.
By the late 1970s, Black Sabbath was a global phenomenon. They had taken the raw chaos of Birmingham's factories and turned it into a new religion for kids who felt lost in the world. The money was rolling in, the tours were relentless, the records were flying off shelves, but behind the wall of sound and fame, cracks had already begun to show. Ozzy, always fragile beneath the surface, leaned hard into substances, drinking, drugs, anything to quiet the noise in his head. The same pain that had fueled his voice now demanded sedation. He partied, he disappeared, he numbed himself. And the more he numbed, the more he drifted away from the band that had saved him. By 1979, those cracks split wide open. Black Sabbath, the family that had given him meaning, had finally had enough. They didn't even tell him face to face. They sent managers and intermediaries to deliver the message. Ozzy was out. For him, it was more than professional rejection. It was personal annihilation. He later admitted, "That band wasn't just a job. It was my family. It was everything." Being fired didn't just take away his livelihood. It ripped away his identity. Without Black Sabbath, who was he? Just John Osborne again, the broken kid from Birmingham who no one wanted. And so Ozzy did what Ozzy always did when the pain became unbearable. He locked himself away in a Los Angeles hotel room for months, living on booze, pills, and despair. Friends stopped calling. Family kept their distance. Even he admitted he thought he was finished, destined to fade away as another rock casualty, remembered as the guy who once fronted a great band but couldn't keep it together. But fate has a strange sense of timing, and fate, in this case, arrived in the form of Sharon Arden. The daughter of Sabbath's powerful manager, Sharon had seen Ozzy at his best and at his absolute worst. Most people had written him off as hopeless. Sharon didn't. She saw the magic buried under the chaos. She marched into that hotel room and laid it out. You were the soul of that band. You were the voice people connected to. You can do this without them. Where everyone else saw a washed-up addict, Sharon saw potential. She didn't just rescue Ozzy from that hotel room, she dragged him back to life. And together, they built something new. With Sharon guiding him and surrounding him with fresh talent, Ozzy launched a solo career. His debut album, Blizzard of Oz, 1980, was a revelation. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley announced to the world that Ozzy wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. His voice had lost none of its edge, and paired with a young guitar prodigy named Randy Rhoads, the music hit like lightning. Crazy Train wasn't just a song, it was a manifesto, a declaration that the so-called washed-up frontman still had enough power to shock the world. Randy's dazzling guitar work, combined with Ozzy's haunting howl, created a sound that didn't just match Black Sabbath's legacy, it carved a new one. The album was a massive success. Fans who thought they'd lost their dark prophet now saw him resurrected, standing taller than ever. Sharon had been right. Ozzy wasn't finished. In fact, his solo career would eventually eclipse even Sabbath's legacy in terms of reach and influence. But while Ozzy's professional life soared, his personal battles never disappeared. He was still haunted by addiction, still wobbling between genius and collapse. Sharon became more than a partner, she became a lifeline. And as he rose higher, tragedy was about to strike harder than ever before.
By 1982, Ozzy Osbourne's solo career was on fire. Blizzard of Oz had silenced the critics who said he was finished, and the follow-up album, Diary of a Madman, proved it wasn't a fluke. At the center of this rebirth was not just Ozzy's voice, but a young guitarist who seemed touched by destiny, Randy Rhoads. Randy was everything Ozzy needed at that moment in his life. He was disciplined, almost monk-like in his dedication to music. While Ozzy lived chaotically, Randy lived deliberately. His guitar playing fused classical elegance with heavy metal ferocity, creating a sound that elevated Ozzy's voice to new heights. On stage, their chemistry was electric. Ozzy, the unchained wild man, and Randy, the calm prodigy, weaving soundscapes that felt both otherworldly and intimate. To Ozzy, Randy was more than a bandmate. He was hope. He was proof that life after Sabbath could be brighter. He often described Randy as the little brother he never had, the stabilizing force he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Sharon later said she'd never seen Ozzy so energized, so focused, so determined to keep creating. For once, the chaos seemed manageable. For once, the future looked possible. And then, in a moment, it was gone. March 19, 1982. The band was traveling through Florida on tour, exhausted but buzzing from the success of their shows. They stopped at a small airfield near Leesburg, where their tour bus driver, who also happened to be a licensed pilot, decided to take a small plane for a joyride. Randy, curious and adventurous, agreed to go along. The details are still debated, but what's clear is that the pilot made a reckless decision. In an attempt to buzz the tour bus as a stunt, the plane came too close, clipping the vehicle and spiraling out of control.
It crashed violently, erupting into flames. Randy Rhoads, just 25 years old, was gone. For Ozzy, time stopped. He watched helplessly as emergency crews fought the fire, knowing before they even reached the wreckage that his friend was dead. In interviews years later, his voice still cracked when he described that day. When Randy died, I felt like part of me died too. The grief was bottomless. Ozzy locked himself away again, this time not out of self-destruction, but out of sheer devastation. He refused to speak for days. He wandered in silence, replaying memories of the gentle, focused young man who had been the anchor to a storm. Sharon feared he might never recover. Randy's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a brutal twist of fate that threatened to end Ozzy's career for good. Fans wondered if he would ever perform again. Some thought he might quit music entirely. And honestly, for a time, Ozzy thought so too. How could he sing Crazy Train without the guitarist who gave the song its pulse? How could he face the stage without the brother he'd finally found? But if there's one thing Ozzy had mastered, it was surviving when everything said he shouldn't. Slowly, painfully, he returned to the stage. Every time he sang Randy's songs, it was like ripping open a scar. But it also became a ritual of remembrance. He dedicated performances to him. He spoke about him endlessly, keeping his memory alive not just for himself, but for the millions of fans who had been changed by Randy's playing. Even decades later, long after his voice began to fade and his body betrayed him, Ozzy never stopped honoring Randy. In interviews, he often said Randy was the one person who truly understood him, not the chaos, not the addiction, but the man underneath all of it. The quiet, broken boy who just wanted to matter. The loss hardened Ozzy in some ways, but it also deepened him. His grief became fuel, his pain became purpose. He poured that anguish into albums like Bark at the Moon and No Rest for the Wicked. The music carried Randy's ghost, echoing in every riff, in every howl and every desperate plea Ozzy pushed into the microphone. But grief alone wasn't Ozzy's enemy. The substances he had relied on since the Sabbath days were still gnawing at him, threatening to finish the job fate had started. And as the 1980s rolled on, tragedy wasn't the only battle on his horizon. Addiction, the demon that had stalked him since the beginning, was about to drag him into one of the darkest chapters of his life.
The 1980s were supposed to be Ozzy Osbourne's golden era. His solo career had exploded. His albums were selling millions. His concerts were chaotic, larger than life, and unforgettable. To fans, he looked unstoppable. But behind the curtain, the truth was far darker. Ozzy was falling apart. Addiction had been with him since his Black Sabbath days, but now it became an all-consuming monster. On tour, it was alcohol from morning to night. Off tour, it was pills, powders, anything within reach. There were nights when he couldn't even remember stepping onto the stage, let alone finishing a set. His bandmates whispered about whether he'd survive another year. Journalists wrote him off as a walking overdose. Fans joked about his slurred speech without realizing how close he was to the edge. Even Sharon, who had pulled him back from the brink after Sabbath, was overwhelmed. She had married him in 1982, hoping their love and partnership would anchor him. But instead, she found herself living with a man who often seemed like a stranger. He was unpredictable, swinging between charm and rage. Some nights, he was tender. Other nights, he was terrifying. The breaking point came in 1989. One night, under the crushing influence of alcohol and drugs, Ozzy snapped. In a blackout, he attacked Sharon, nearly choking her to death before collapsing into unconsciousness. When he woke up in a jail cell, he had no memory of what he had done, only the horrifying reality of his wife's bruises and the police charges staring him in the face. It was the moment when even Ozzy realized the monster wasn't just hurting him, it was destroying everyone around him. Sharon had every reason to leave. Any other person would have walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she set a brutal condition: get help or lose everything. And for once, Ozzy listened. He checked into rehab more than once.
He faced psychiatrists who told him bluntly that he was a danger to himself and others. He was put on medications, watched closely, stripped of the substances that had become his crutches. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't quick, and it definitely wasn't easy. Ozzy relapsed more times than he cared to admit, but Sharon refused to let him vanish into that black hole. She fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to climb out. The 1990s marked a strange rebirth. His music shifted, becoming both heavier and more reflective. Albums like No More Tears, 1991, proved that the Prince of Darkness wasn't done yet. The title track, dripping with sorrow and rage, sounded less like a rock anthem and more like a man screaming into the abyss, determined not to drown. It became one of his signature songs, a haunting reflection of the pain he'd endured and the fight to survive it. But Ozzy's recovery wasn't just about music. It was about facing himself. He admitted publicly and brutally honestly that he had been a monster, that he had hurt the people he loved most. And while Sharon forgave him, she never let him forget. She became not just his wife, but his manager, his guardrail, his anchor. And then came the curveball no one expected: the Osbournes. In 2002, MTV aired the reality series that turned the world's scariest heavy metal icon into America's most bizarre sitcom dad. Viewers tuned in by the millions to watch Ozzy stumble around his mansion, mumble at the dogs, and bicker with his kids over breakfast. To outsiders, it looked like comedy gold. To insiders, it was just Ozzy being Ozzy. Chaotic, hilarious, often incomprehensible, but undeniably real. The show made him more famous than ever. Suddenly, people who had never listened to Black Sabbath or Crazy Train were quoting Ozzy's rambling one-liners. The Prince of Darkness had become a household name in the strangest way possible. And with every new episode, the checks rolled in, adding millions more to the Osbourne empire. But here's the irony. While the Osbournes brought laughs to millions, Ozzy himself was struggling behind the cameras. His health was deteriorating, his addiction still lurked in the shadows, and the weight of decades of abuse on his body was becoming undeniable. Fame was once again masking fragility. Still, through it all, one truth remained constant: Sharon. She had been attacked by him, betrayed by him, dragged through hell by his demons, and yet she stayed. Not out of weakness, but out of a stubborn belief that the man she loved was still worth saving. And in the darkest nights, when Ozzy wanted to disappear completely, that belief was often the only thing keeping him alive. But as the new millennium rolled on, even Sharon's strength couldn't shield Ozzy from what was coming, because while addiction could be fought and fame could be managed, there were battles on the horizon that no amount of willpower could stop. Accidents, illness, and the slow, unstoppable march of time. By the time the 2000s rolled in, Ozzy Osbourne had already cheated death more times than anyone could count. Drugs hadn't finished him. Alcohol hadn't finished him. Tragedy hadn't finished him. He seemed indestructible. But the truth is, the body always keeps the score, and Ozzy's body was ready to collect. It started with accidents. In 2003, a freak ATV crash on his Buckinghamshire estate nearly killed him. He wasn't racing or showing off. He was just riding when the quad bike flipped, crushing his collarbone, breaking multiple ribs, and puncturing a lung. He stopped breathing on the ground until his bodyguard revived him. When doctors rushed him to the hospital, they weren't sure he'd make it through the night. But Ozzy, true to form, woke up days later joking about how he'd survived worse. That was his way, always making a laugh out of near death. Yet the crash left scars that never healed. His body, already weakened from years of abuse, now carried permanent damage. In 2019, it got worse. A nighttime fall in his Los Angeles home dislodged metal rods that had been placed in his spine after the ATV accident. Emergency surgery left him bedridden for months, fighting off infections, unable to perform, and forced to cancel tours. For a man who lived to be on stage, it was torture. He admitted later that he thought his career was officially over. And then came the cruelest blow of all. In 2020, Ozzy revealed to the world that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a degenerative condition that strips away control over the body little by little. For a man whose entire identity had been tied to his presence, his voice, and his energy, it was the cruelest irony. Fans who had grown up worshiping the invincible Prince of Darkness were stunned. Ozzy admitted that he had been living with symptoms for years, tremors, stiffness, fatigue, but had kept it private until it became impossible to hide. In interviews, his voice shook, but his words were brutally honest. "I'm not good with secrets. I can't walk around with it anymore." The diagnosis didn't just affect him, it hit his family too. Sharon broke down on television, admitting that watching him deteriorate was like losing him in pieces. His children, who had grown up with both the chaos and the comedy of their dad, suddenly had to face the reality that the man who had seemed eternal was in fact slipping away. And yet, in classic Ozzy fashion, he refused to let Parkinson silence him. Even as his body betrayed him, he recorded new music. His 2020 album, Ordinary Man, was a raw reflection on mortality. Tracks like Under the Graveyard didn't just sound like Ozzy, they sounded like confessions. He sang about regret, about fading, about staring into the abyss and realizing it was closer than ever. The follow-up, Patient Number 9, 2022, doubled down on that honesty, featuring collaborations with legends like Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton. It wasn't the sound of a man giving up, it was the sound of a man refusing to fade quietly. But off stage, the fight was brutal. He admitted he could barely walk some days. He underwent multiple surgeries. He spoke openly about depression, about wondering how much longer he could endure. And yet, there was Sharon, always Sharon, by his side at every hospital bed, every appointment, every long night when the pain was too much to bear. In public, he joked about his condition. He laughed about falling apart, about being held together by nuts and bolts. But in private, those closest to him saw the toll it took on him. Ozzy, the man who had once howled like a banshee on stage, now struggled to hold a coffee cup. By 2025, the decline was undeniable. His health issues piled up. Parkinson's, spinal injuries, infections, and the accumulated damage of decades of punishment. And though he fought to the end, performing became impossible. The man who had once commanded arenas with a scream now spent his final days surrounded not by crowds, but by family. And yet, even in those moments, there was defiance. He never begged for pity, never begged for sympathy. He had lived louder, wilder, and harder than almost anyone alive. And he faced death the same way he faced life, head-on, unfiltered, with no apologies. When Ozzy Osbourne finally passed away in 2025, it wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. Fans didn't just lose a rock icon, they lost the man who gave the outcasts, the broken, and the forgotten a voice. He didn't just scream for himself, he screamed for everyone who had ever felt invisible. And though his body finally gave out, his voice, raw, haunting, unforgettable, still echoes. In the riffs, in the records, in the millions who found strength in the sound of a broken boy from Birmingham who refused to stay silent.
Ozzy Osbourne's life was not supposed to turn out the way it did. By every logical measure, he shouldn't have made it out of Birmingham. He shouldn't have survived the fists, the hunger, the silence. He shouldn't have survived Black Sabbath firing him. He shouldn't have survived addiction, overdose scares, arrests, accidents, or the grief that gutted him when Randy Rhoads died. He shouldn't have survived Parkinson's, broken bones, or his own self-destruction. And yet, he did. Ozzy lived his life like a walking contradiction. He was chaos and comedy, darkness and light, fragile and indestructible all at once. He could terrify audiences with his banshee howl on stage, then make them laugh by mumbling nonsense to his dogs on the Osbournes. He was a global icon, yet he never stopped calling himself just a damn idiot from Aston. He was the Prince of Darkness, but also the father who cried when his kids grew up and left home.
That contradiction is exactly why he mattered. For the fans who had been outcasts, loners, bullied kids, or people who never felt like they belonged anywhere, Ozzy was proof that survival was possible. He didn't hide his scars. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He put the pain on display. And in doing so, he gave millions of others permission to do the same. His voice wasn't just entertainment. It was therapy. The legacy he leaves isn't just about records sold, though there were plenty, over 100 million across his career, both with Black Sabbath and as a solo artist. It's not just about awards, though he collected Grammys, MTV honors, and even inductions into halls of fame. And it's not just about money, though the Osbourne family's fortune reached into the hundreds of millions. His real legacy is cultural, generational, eternal. Without Ozzy, there's no heavy metal as we know it. Black Sabbath laid the foundation for everything from Iron Maiden to Metallica to Slipknot. His solo work inspired countless musicians to fuse vulnerability with aggression, to scream their truth, no matter how ugly it sounded. And his public battles with addiction, mental health, and illness opened doors for conversations that rock stars before him never dared to have in the spotlight. His mistakes became lessons. The near loss of Sharon in 1989 forced him and his fans to confront the ugly truth about addiction and violence. His endless relapses showed the world that recovery is not a straight line, but a lifelong battle. And his openness about Parkinson's helped strip away stigma from a disease too often hidden in shame. In the end, Ozzy's story isn't one of perfection. It's one of survival. He was messy, reckless, and often his own worst enemy. But he kept getting back up, again and again, until finally, time itself did what no drug, no accident, no scandal, no critic could ever do. It silenced him. And even then, not completely. Because his voice still lives in every spin of Paranoid, in every scream of Crazy Train, in every trembling lyric of Ordinary Man. Every time a teenager picks up a guitar and plays a heavy riff, Ozzy's shadow is there. Every time an outsider feels less alone because of a song, Ozzy's spirit echoes. Sharon once said, "Ozzy is the most misunderstood man I've ever known, but he's also the most loved." That's the paradox of his legacy. He was never just the Prince of Darkness. He was also the patron saint of the broken, the bizarre, and the damned. And maybe that's the greatest lesson his life leaves behind. You don't have to be perfect to matter. You don't have to be clean to shine. You don't even have to be understood to change the world. You just have to keep screaming into the void until someone, somewhere, hears you. Ozzy Osbourne did that. From Aston's back alleys to the world's biggest stages, he screamed, and the world will never forget the sound. So when we talk about legacy, let's be clear. Ozzy Osbourne didn't just make music. He made millions of invisible people feel seen. He made pain an anthem. He made survival into art. And though the man is gone, the echo remains louder, darker, and more eternal than even he could have imagined. Long live the Prince of Darkness.